Coca-Cola's logo is more recognizable than the Christian cross. And behind that unbelievable success, there's a lot more than you'd expect. Troubling partnerships, falsified research, manipulation, and even allegations of murders of people who got in their way. I'm going to tell you how a drink created by an addict became a global giant, teaming up with a company that's faced over 150,000 lawsuits for poisoning people, and how their political influence turned Coca-Cola into a baron in its industry. And even though in ads we see it surrounded by smiling faces, it's definitely not a real symbol of happiness. I promise that after watching this video, the irony behind the image you see behind me will become obvious to all of you. The year 1886, Columbus, Georgia. An American pharmacist addicted to cocaine develops a formula in his own pharmacy, hoping it will make him rich. That man is John Pemberton. During the Civil War, he suffered severe injuries. His chest was cut open by a saber, and medics gave him massive doses of morphine just so he could endure the pain. And even though no one thought he'd survive, Pemberton recovers. But the morphine addiction stays with him for the rest of his life. John starts looking for an alternative. Back then, addiction to this opioid was a common problem among many soldiers. Beyond its side effects like drowsiness and breathing problems, morphine is easy to overdose on, and that often ends in death. It's also a substance that can hook you mentally after just one use, making it hard to stop taking more doses, to keep reaching for it again and again, especially when you're already in pain, just like Pemberton was. The pharmacist starts experimenting with coca leaves, looking for something that might help him break the habit. Yes, he wanted to replace morphine with cocaine. As absurd as it sounds today, back then, based on the medical knowledge at the time, it was used for everything from toothaches to heart conditions, and it didn't raise the same kind of alarm it does now. It was also an era of so-called miracle cures, the kind that promised drink 3 glasses a day, every single day, and you'll never get sick again. When Pemberton creates his own formula, he takes inspiration from a popular wine that was known around the world. It contained cocaine, and it was advertised as a way to boost health and energy. He does the exact same thing. A glass of his drink cost 5 cents and contained about 9 milligrams of cocaine, which was considered a trace amount. On top of that, the drink included cola nuts as a source of caffeine, sugar, and ingredients like phosphoric acid meant to ease pain. In its first version, the drink also contained wine, but I'll explain in a moment why that had to change. John Pemberton starts selling his mixture in pharmacies under the name Pemberton's French Wine Coca, as a remedy for women and for people dealing with mental fatigue. Why did he choose that exact audience? In the 19th century, there was this belief that women were naturally more fragile and less mentally resilient, and that household duties and a sedentary lifestyle only made fatigue and depression worse. Shortly after John introduced his drink to other pharmacies, alcohol sales were banned in Atlanta. Prohibition made it impossible to keep selling it, and Pemberton was back at square one searching for a new formula. By accident, he mixes the base with carbonated water, and his accountant comes up with a catchier name, Coca-Cola, based on its ingredients. To boost the flavor, John adds even more cane sugar, and starts promoting the new invention not just as a remedy, but as something that gives you a unique kind of refreshment. Here in Poland, Coca-Cola doesn't use cane sugar like it did in the original formula. In the 1970s, it was replaced with high fructose corn syrup. It was much cheaper, but also worse for our health. It increases appetite, contributes to obesity, and raises the risk of conditions like strokes and heart attacks. If you're not checking labels, pay attention and avoid products that contain it. As more and more people started worrying about the risks of that syrup, Coca-Cola announced it would switch to sucrose, the regular sugar we all know. In Poland, that happened in 2014. What's interesting is that in places like Mexico or parts of Africa, you won't find high fructose corn syrup in Coca-Cola at all. They still use cane sugar there, for several reasons. It was in Europe and the US where it made sense to invest in syrup production, to cut costs, even at the expense of our health. In Mexico, cane sugar is also cheaper, and people there can actually taste the difference. That's why Coca-Cola still uses it. And now, let's go back to Pemberton for a moment, to wrap up that part of the story. Despite the initial excitement, he didn't see much potential in Coca-Cola. He was selling about 9 glasses a day, and customer feedback, to put it mildly, wasn't very positive. For comparison, today Coca-Cola sells nearly 2 billion bottles a day. John Pemberton never got to experience the success of the company he started. Not long after Coca-Cola hit the market in its new form, his morphine addiction takes over. Desperate for money, he begins selling off the rights to his formula. As if that wasn't enough, he was also diagnosed with stomach cancer. He wanted to secure his son Charles before he died, but instead of shares in Coca-Cola, Charles chose to take cash. Charles sells those shares to another pharmacist in Atlanta for $300, which today would be around $10,000. At 57, John Pemberton dies of cancer, and his son Charles becomes addicted to opium. 6 years after his father's death, Charles is found unconscious, with a dose of opium lying next to him. And sadly, he can't be saved. John Pemberton, despite creating Coca-Cola, died in poverty, never realizing the true potential of what he had built. Before he died, he sold off literally everything, just to cover the debts he fell into because of his addiction. And besides the sugar, the source of caffeine in Coca-Cola also changed. Instead of cola nuts, to cut costs, they first started extracting caffeine from tea leaf waste. And later, working with Monsanto, they developed synthetic caffeine from chemicals found in coal tar. The same company was also behind a cheaper sugar substitute, aspartame, found in Coca-Cola Zero. Monsanto has even been called the biggest poisoner of humanity. They were also among the companies that supplied Zyklon B to the camps at Auschwitz and carried out lethal experiments on prisoners. And during the Vietnam War, they sprayed a chemical known as Agent Orange over the jungle, where guerrilla fighters were hiding. It had strong carcinogenic effects, and years later, it led to severe skin diseases among civilians, as well as American soldiers. More than 150,000 children were born with deformities or intellectual disabilities. And beyond Vietnam, this substance was also used in Korea, with Monsanto as one of the main producers. None of that stopped us from putting our own food supply in the hands of that same company. The massive corporation Monsanto spent years manipulating public opinion and hiding the truth about how harmful its products were to farmers. Right now, just because of one of their products, Roundup, a widely used herbicide, Monsanto has been hit with over 150,000 lawsuits, including class actions. The main ingredient in Roundup is glyphosate, and it's still used by farmers today. Monsanto funded studies that helped scientists convince us this product was safe, that there was nothing to worry about, but in reality, it increases the risk of cancer. Aspartame is also controversial. Even though it's been approved by most health organizations, some scientists still have serious doubts, and those doubts haven't gone away. To show you just how strong Monsanto's political influence really is, let's look at a case from 2021, when they were fined 400,000 euros for illegally collecting data on journalists and politicians. Their list included around 1,500 names, including influential figures from politics and the media, some of whom rose to their positions through cooperation with Monsanto. There were also former employees of government agencies meant to oversee the company, who later went on to work for Monsanto. And in 2010, even Bill Gates bought shares in the company. The evidence clearly shows that Monsanto was fully aware of how carcinogenic and toxic their products were. And for over 40 years, they took no action to change it. On top of that, they worked to undermine anyone who tried to stand in their way and expose the truth. With lawsuits on such a massive scale, access was granted to around 2.5 million pages of Monsanto's internal documents, confirming that our lives meant nothing to them, and that the only goal was to sell as much product as possible. In their ads, they claimed Roundup was so safe, you didn't even need protective gear while spraying it, and the labels didn't include warnings, not even something as basic as avoiding skin contact with a chemical product. The only warning that could be found was on labels from 1997 and 2007. And even then, it felt more like a loose suggestion than a real warning, something easy to ignore. It said users should wear a long-sleeve shirt, long pants, socks and shoes, nothing more. If that already shocked you, just wait and see what happens next. In 2018, Monsanto, trying to escape growing protests and accusations, effectively hides behind the German pharmaceutical giant Bayer, which acquires the company for 63 billion euros, taking it under its wing. Almost immediately, people started saying this was just a way to cover their tracks, to keep the public from seeing what was really going on, while in reality nothing changed. There were also reports that Bayer, to avoid paying out massive compensation, was considering bankruptcy, then reopening as a clean new company, putting pressure on lawyers to accept the settlements they were offering. Coca-Cola also funded studies meant to hide the harmful effects of their drinks on our health. In secret, they financed a research institute whose main goal was to convince people that to fight obesity, you should focus on exercise, not on how many calories you consume. That's exactly why they funded sports facilities, partnered with athletes, and got involved in events like the Olympic Games and the FIFA World Cup. These efforts were meant to shift our focus to exercise, instead of diet. They also funded their own studies, hiding their involvement through internal research institutes, and then used those scientists to promote ideas that worked in Coca-Cola's favor. In 2020, the activities of the Global Energy Balance Network were analyzed, an organization where Coca-Cola paid scientists to downplay the impact of sugary drinks on the obesity crisis. And when the Chicago City Council in 2012 wanted to introduce a tax on soda, Coca-Cola gave $3 million to push programs focused on sports instead. Coincidentally, right after that act of generosity, the idea of taxing Coca-Cola was dropped. A similar situation also happened here in Poland. In 2019, Coca-Cola hired a PR firm to push back against the introduction of a sugar tax. The campaign aimed to convince us that sugar is present in many foods, not just in sweetened drinks, so raising the price of Coca-Cola made little sense. That targeting one product wouldn't solve the problem, and wouldn't change how people actually eat. But despite the protests and the campaign, the sugar tax was eventually passed in Poland and came into effect on January 1st, 2021. Contracts with scientists working in Coca-Cola's research institute showed that before any results were published, Coca-Cola had to approve them, and could shut the studies down at any time without giving a reason. They were also accused of trying to influence search results online by hiring PR agencies to manipulate algorithms, reducing the visibility of critical studies and articles about Coca-Cola. They also hired scientists who had previously received funding from Coca-Cola or other food companies, and when this information was revealed, Coca-Cola announced it was shutting down the university. If you have scientists among your friends or family, ask them how often situations like this happen, where the company funding the research already expects a specific outcome. The scientist either picks methods that support that conclusion, or they don't get the funding. 40% of Coca-Cola's global production takes place in regions with high or extreme water scarcity, and the company refuses to explain why. Look at what this looks like in southern Mexico. The water there is so contaminated that even after boiling it's not safe to drink, so the only option left is bottled water, which is less available and more expensive than Coca-Cola. And according to local residents, the water problems began when Coca-Cola opened its bottling plant there. That's when the water suddenly started disappearing. At the same time, locals were collecting rainwater. The Coca-Cola bottling plant in San Cristobal was allowed to extract over 400 million liters of water a year. Because of the desperate situation locals were in, the regional government asked for Coca-Cola's water extraction license to be revoked, but the request was rejected by the Federal Water Authority. They argued that the water taken by Coca-Cola does not reduce the amount available to residents. It's worth adding that the National Water Commissioner appointed there was a man who had previously served as CEO of Coca-Cola in Mexico. Residents not only can't do laundry or even take a bath, because there's no water in their taps, they've also become completely dependent on Coca-Cola. The level of education there is much lower than here in Poland, so with Coca-Cola available everywhere and even cheaper than bottled water, people started giving it to drink, even to newborns. Coca-Cola gives residents refrigerators with its logo, and even paint for shops and homes, but only on the condition that the buildings are repainted in Coca-Cola colors and display the bottle symbol. No one is surprised there by shops where you can buy only this sugary drink. At the same time, Coca-Cola is praised by the government for helping grow the economy. And this is interesting too, because based on available information, The company employs around 400 people, and most locals didn't qualify due to low education levels. So Coca-Cola promised to fund educational facilities for residents, but it never went beyond promises. Mexicans have become the biggest consumers of sugary drinks in the world. A state of emergency was declared there because of diabetes, and doctors warned that Coca-Cola is to blame. Before their bottling plant appeared, diabetes was practically unheard of in that region. It's hard to estimate the true scale, because people there get tested far less often. But over the past 3 years, deaths caused by diabetes have increased by 77%. Because of diabetes complications, a limb is amputated there every 7 minutes. And people are afraid to go to the hospital early, because as they claim, doctors cut off limbs instead of treating them, since it's cheaper. I hate to say this, but talking to doctors I know, I learned that in Poland, amputations in people with diabetes also happen very often, and our country has one of the highest rates of diabetes-related amputations in Europe. These aren't rare cases. This is something happening on a regular basis. In southern Mexico, Coca-Cola has literally become part of daily life, even used in religious rituals. It might seem funny to us, but think about how often we reach for unhealthy sweets or alcohol on different occasions, giving something harmful to the people we love. Manufacturers wrap chocolates in beautiful packaging, often shaped like hearts, convincing us through ads that it's a real sign of love and care. Sugar activates the same areas in the brain as drugs, and addiction to it can be even harder to overcome, because it's socially accepted. If we gave children psychoactive substances as a reward, it would cause outrage. But a candy bar or chocolate? That's become completely normal, exactly as the producers wanted. Let's go back to Coca-Cola's story for a moment, to better understand their strategy, and in a second, I'll tell you what the contract killings are about. Asa Candler, who bought Coca-Cola from John Pemberton and his son Charles, went all in on aggressive marketing. Back then, besides posters placed literally everywhere, he also handed out free coupons. Candler knew exactly what he was doing. Once people tasted Coca-Cola loaded with sugar and caffeine, they'd come back for more. In 1901, the advertising budget was $100,000, and just 10 years later, it had grown to over $1 million a year. Coca-Cola signs were placed everywhere, even on ballot boxes and inside churches. They wanted to create the sense that Coca-Cola is always present during important moments. And Candler also launched one of the first celebrity partnerships in advertising. All of this was meant to earn our trust and build the habit of choosing Coca-Cola over water as early as possible, starting from a very young age. And Coca-Cola isn't the only company targeting children. Brands know that the earlier you start reaching for their products, the more likely you are to stick with them for life without even questioning it. Coca-Cola stands out, among other things, for its direct partnerships with schools. Under these deals, schools often received funding, equipment, or support for educational programs, in exchange for giving Coca-Cola products access inside the school. Despite repeated promises to stop targeting children under the age of 12, the company continues to break that commitment. They also use a clever mechanism in their advertising. Consuming sugar during intense emotional moments makes the brain store those experiences more strongly, increasing the chance you'll reach for that product again in the future. That's why, for years, they've trained us to see Coca-Cola everywhere. There's happiness, friendship, and love. It's meant to feel like pleasure, simple emotions anyone can afford. In 1916, Asa Candler steps away from the company to run for mayor of Atlanta, a position he wins. The shares he bought for $2,300, he sells to investors for $25 million. A new style of advertising appears, where Coca-Cola deliberately introduces a sexual context, showing young women in revealing outfits that spark desire, while viewers subconsciously link it to the brand. In films and commercials, Coca-Cola is positioned as a symbol of the American lifestyle. In 1929, Coca-Cola fully removes cocaine from the drink, due to anti-drug laws and a major shift in how it was seen by the public. They still use coca leaves, but in a processed form, without the psychoactive substance. And over the years, Coca-Cola has faced very serious allegations, including claims of involvement with death squads in Colombia. In 2001, a Colombian labor union filed a federal lawsuit in Miami, accusing Coca-Cola and its bottlers of working with paramilitary groups that intimidate, kidnap and kill union leaders. The lawsuit names specific cases, including the killing of Isidro Gil at a Coca-Cola plant in Caripa. Isidro was an active union member, representing workers at the bottling facility. In broad daylight, attackers entered the plant and fired 10 shots at him. An hour later, another union member is kidnapped from his own home. Those events led to the deaths of 8 people. The attackers burned the archives, then gathered the plant workers, telling them that if they didn't leave the union by 4 p.m., they would face the same fate. The resignation forms were already prepared by the Coca-Cola plant manager. Fearing for their lives, workers left the union in large numbers and fled the city. The men who forced them out stayed outside the factory gates for 2 more months, and experienced workers, who had been earning about $380 a month, were replaced with new ones for a third of that. Witnesses all said the same thing, that the group behind it was directly linked to local elites and business figures, but the court dismissed the case against Coca-Cola, saying there wasn't enough evidence and that the situation had no connection to the United States. New information from 2016 revealed that multinational corporations often used groups like this, but it's hard to prove direct responsibility because they operate through intermediaries, and this wasn't the only case. In 2005, Turkish police themselves attacked over 150 Coca-Cola workers and their families, who were protesting and fighting for their rights. The entire operation was carried out on direct orders from a prosecutor, and over 100 union members were fired. Throughout its history, Coca-Cola has shown again and again that profit is what matters most, and that actions meant to fix things are often just for show. The biggest growth of this drink came during World War II. 1941, Coca-Cola's president Robert Woodruff declares that every American soldier should have access to Coca-Cola for just 5 cents, no matter where he is, even on the front lines. While other manufacturers were struggling with a severe shortage of sugar, treated as a strategic resource, Coca-Cola, with government approval, kept getting it for production without major restrictions, even during wartime. They went on to build 64 new bottling plants, along with mobile units that moved with the troops, following them wherever they went. Coca-Cola employees wore military uniforms and were treated like officers, while at the same time their competitors were going bankrupt. We can estimate that the military purchased over 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola, and the company, seen as a symbol of patriotism and loyalty to the United States, was in reality also supporting the other side. At first, Coca-Cola wasn't a drink that brought positive associations among Germans. On the American side, Woodruff was giving powerful speeches, emphasizing that US soldiers could always count on him, and that wherever they went, Coca-Cola would be waiting for them. For that stance, Americans embraced the drink, and at the same time, in Germany, Coca-Cola bottles featured the swastika on their labels, and keychains were produced to celebrate Germany. Coca-Cola even became a sponsor of the Olympic Games in Berlin, and their posters were placed literally everywhere. In Coca-Cola factories in Germany, prisoners from across Europe were forced to work in brutal conditions. It was this forced labor that helped Coca-Cola generate massive profits. And Max Kiff, who was in charge of distribution in Germany, was so fascinated with Hitler that he celebrated his birthday inside the company, ordering employees to salute in his honor. When this came to light, imports of Coca-Cola's base syrup to Germany were banned. And that's how Fanta was created. Kiff looked for a solution, using whey left over from cheese production, along with fruit scraps from juice factories, whatever was available at the time. That's why Fanta was called a drink made from leftovers. Most of us don't realize how many of the world's biggest brands used World War II to secure their position on the global markets, building power in the middle of chaos. In reality, the only thing that mattered was profit, and years later the scandals are hidden, softened, and pushed into the background. Coca-Cola produces over 125 billion plastic bottles every year, making it the largest producer of plastic waste in the world, and more than 90% of them, instead of being recycled, end up in our forests, oceans and landfills, where they stay for generations. Just to put it in perspective, a single plastic bottle can take anywhere from 450 to even 1000 years to break down, And as it does, microplastics contaminate the soil and water, eventually making their way back into our bodies. Coca-Cola has repeatedly claimed they are concerned about this, and that they are doing everything they can to fix it. But what does the reality look like? In response to growing criticism, they take certain actions, but the goal isn't to protect the environment, it's to improve their image. Coca-Cola funds various recycling programs, but in reality, their effectiveness is low, and they mainly serve to create the impression that the company cares. They also promote eco-friendly bottles made from recycled plastic, even though that plastic is still single-use. It's like collecting trash in a leaking bag and bragging that you're cleaning up. In this case, a court of appeals ruled that Coca-Cola must respond to a lawsuit, accusing the company of misleading customers into believing it cares about the environment. Environmental groups point out that only about 9% of all plastic ever produced has actually been recycled, making the whole system largely ineffective. Coca-Cola keeps insisting that we prefer plastic bottles, but according to research, most of us would actually choose glass. Glass bottles are also better than plastic when it comes to taste, because glass doesn't react chemically with the liquid, unlike plastic or metal. But Coca-Cola claims their drink always tastes just as good. The real reason plastic bottles exist isn't because customers prefer them, it's because of shipping costs. Glass is heavier than plastic, so producing glass bottles would require factories in every country, which also means giving up part of the profit. It's far more profitable to make plastic bottles in places where labor is cheap, and then ship them anywhere in the world. Coca-Cola has been accused many times of abusing its market power. For example, during negotiations with retailers, pressuring them to accept its terms. In 2022, Edeka, the largest supermarket chain in Germany with over 4,000 stores, filed a lawsuit against Coca-Cola, claiming the company cut off deliveries during price negotiations to put pressure on them using supply as leverage to gain the upper hand. At first, a district court in Hamburg ruled that deliveries to Edeka had to continue under the existing terms, and recognized it as an abuse of their dominant position. But later in the proceedings, the case was dismissed, and Coca-Cola publicly stated that its business model is fully compliant with the law. A similar situation happened in Poland, but it wasn't about price negotiations. In 2015, the Consumer Protection Authority fined Coca-Cola 137 million zloty for pressuring local businesses that didn't want to include their drinks in their offer. Another interesting story is one of the biggest mistakes Coca-Cola made. Back in the time of Asa Candler, at that point, Coca-Cola was only sold on site. They mixed the concentrate with carbonated water, and that was it. For Candler, it was a very comfortable setup, because he didn't have to worry about logistics at all. They shipped the syrup in barrels, and only checked whether sellers were sticking to the right proportions. Candler didn't believe Coca-Cola would ever sell as a takeaway drink in bottles. At the time, almost no one was thinking about it, mainly because of the high costs and logistical challenges. Two lawyers, Joseph and Benjamin, approached Candler with an offer that they would take on all the risk of bottling the drink themselves and cover all the expenses. Candler figured he wasn't going to do it himself anyway, so the only thing that could happen was selling a bit more of his syrup. He signs the deal, and for a symbolic $1, gives Joseph and Benjamin the rights to bottle Coca-Cola. Candler, to put it lightly, completely misjudged the scale, and their contract didn't include any limits or future price increases for the syrup. So he signed a deal that guaranteed bottlers would get Coca-Cola concentrate at the same price, forever, no matter how production costs change. At first, Candler was thrilled, because with orders coming in from the bottlers, he sold a large amount of concentrate, which meant a big influx of cash. But as the cost of ingredients like sugar kept rising, producing the syrup and selling it at those old fixed prices became less and less profitable. The bottling side kept scaling up, while Coca-Cola Company's profits were going down. Candler tried to renegotiate the terms, but as you can probably guess, Joseph and Benjamin weren't interested at all. This turned into a long legal battle, where Candler tried to prove the deal was unfair and poorly constructed. But in the end, the courts ruled in favor of the bottlers, and Coca-Cola had to keep supplying the concentrate at the fixed price, no matter how the economy changed. So they ended up in a situation where most of the profit was going to the bottlers, not Coca-Cola and not Candler, who had created the demand through his marketing. The contract wasn't completely airtight, so it left some room for interpretation. And that's how Coca-Cola, over many years and at the cost of hundreds of millions of dollars, slowly worked its way out of that situation. They introduced strict controls over bottlers, changed the shape of the bottles, making it clear that only those could be used, and through penalties and pressure, they forced bottlers to co-finance advertising campaigns and banned them from bottling competing drinks. At the same time, they were opening their own bottling plants outside the United States, expanding a franchise model, and introducing new packaging like cans, which weren't covered by the original contract. Looking at the history of brands as popular as Coca-Cola, you start to see just how different the image we're sold is from reality. Polished speeches from CEOs, ads overflowing with love and happiness, but in reality, it's all about our money. Corporations are not your friends. And in developed countries, to silence inconvenient people, all it takes is a team of lawyers and PR experts who can destroy you in the eyes of the public. And even if the truth comes out years later, honestly, who will still care about that person? Success and power don't go to those who are right, but to those who spend more money to manipulate us more effectively. If you thought playback or autotune were the biggest scams in the music industry, check out my latest video where I show something way more shocking: hiring people who secretly sing for the stars we later watch on stage and on screen. Click the thumbnail and discover the biggest scam in the music industry. This is called Lemon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a moment.